Okay, so now let's move on to the next category of disorders. This would be stress and trauma-related disorders. One thing, first of all, that we need to know, stress and trauma-related disorders were actually aligned or very close, or some of them were even within the category of anxiety disorders. But in the DSM 5th edition, they shifted and they moved into the unrelated trauma and stress related category. But it's actually very similar as far as the emotions that they may evoke. By stress, a lot of us may feel sensations physiologically that resemble anxiety. I guess though that what establishes a difference here is that this specific line category of disorders have been evoked by a traumatic event, which then lead to the stress and the anxiety and all sorts of things. Now, let's first talk about stress-related disorders, and let me ask you, have you ever experienced a traumatic event? Let me tell you one experience that I had. I love to travel. And in my travels, I have never been the biggest fan in the world of flying, but I don't dislike it either. It's a cool experience. I have been in many airports, in many flights in my life, but there was one time where we had, with a group of students, a long flight from Amsterdam to Atlanta, looking like at an 8-9 hour flight. Long flight, I was feeling relaxed, I was feeling chill, cool, everything was great. And about 6 hours into the flight, the pilot voiced the whole cabin saying, hey, we're going to experience some turbulence. He's going to get, and I still remember his word, bumpy. So, buckle your seats, hang on. And I remember a student sitting in front of me, looking back through her seat to me, and I'm like, relax, cool, so everything's good. And then, it was rough. Then it got rough. This might have lasted for an hour, maybe an hour and a half. Honestly, I don't remember. For me, it felt like eternity, but it was rough. It was very rough turbulence. Everything was moving like that. I had a screen in front of me, and I couldn't even turn off the screen because my finger was moving all over the place. So it was a rough experience for me, and I noticed until I got to the airport and I was walking that I was touching my heart and it was racing, and I noticed that I had all this adrenaline in me. So it seemed like my parasympathetic nervous system just exploded because it was preparing me for a situation that evoked danger, and it took me a while to calm down. After this experience, I feel a bit uneasy going on airports. I still enjoy it. I still love to travel, but when you're in a flight and everything is now stable and everything is smooth, when you have the notification that you can unlock your seat belts, I like that. Not because I can just have more freedom, but because I feel like, okay, we're safe. But when I see that, again, that click button, I start to feel uneasy because I'm like, oh man, here we go again. I start to experience traits of what would be a type of trauma stress related disorder. If you remember, we had a discussion about traits versus diagnosis. Just because I have traits doesn't mean that I have a diagnosis. I do not have PTSD, but I do have traits because I might feel uncomfortable or somewhat stressed. What distinguishes those that have experienced a traumatic, maybe a lot of you, maybe you have experienced a traumatic disorder, but what distinguishes those that experience PTSD for those that don't is then the 3 Ds. To what point is it distressful, deviant, to what point is it dysfunctional? Let's talk a little bit about PTSD. First of all, PTSD have not been forever in the field. PTSD is specifically a category of a diagnosis that emerged past the Second World War, because soldiers that were coming from the Second World War, which is the most bloody war that we've ever had in our history in humanity, we're coming back with this tough, rough symptoms. Some of them were physically paralyzed. A lot of them were having nightmares. A lot of them were having severe anxiety. A lot of them were killing themselves. And it seemed like it had existed before, but there was not a name for it. So they gave it a name. They call it shell shock. Shell shock eventually evolved into the term that we now consider PTSD. What distinguishes PTSD from acute stress disorder is another type of stress-related disorder that happens right after a trauma. So one time I happened to see my mom going through an accident, and she broke her ankle, and the sight of watching her ankle so explicitly broken was going through my mind over and over and over again, and I couldn't get this image out of my mind. As time went by, it eventually diminished. So most of us that experience a traumatic event, eventually, with time, we start to diminish it. What distinguishes, though, PTSD from acute stress can be more common because it's right after you experience a disorder. But with PTSD, that doesn't fade away, which is what is most common. The traumatic event in our mind starts to fade away with time. With PTSD, doesn't. It remains constant, or it goes up. Things that can be related to the traumatic event now may evoke recollections, which can be explicit or implicit, and it makes life very difficult for a person. Of all, in our country, in our nation, in our culture, of all disorders that exist, PTSD is the one that has a very strong, specific population. You think of PTSD, you think of war veterans. PTSD is not unique to the military. PTSD is something that anyone can have. You go through a car accident, you may develop PTSD because of that. You were assaulted one time, you may have PTSD because of that. And things in the environment may have become a trigger, and it can be something that is quite the most normal thing, but for someone else it may be. So you hear maybe stories about how people that were next to a gun shop cannot see fireworks because the loud noises can startle them, and it leads to traits of PTSD. You may hear people that you cannot be touched in the back. You may hear people that cannot have sudden loud noises. You can have people that they cannot have their lights turned off immediately, and so on and so on. The most unique case that I can recall in my experience, one time there was a woman who, according to her recollection, as she was now in a psychiatric hospital, was in what she thought the more normal state, and she was actually in a date, having dinner, and specifically in the restaurant there was a brand of wine that was served a lot, and there was a constant smell of that wine in the restaurant. So she had been assaulted and abused for many, many, many years by her former husband. And the husband would specifically come in after her after he had been drinking. What had he been drinking? That specific kind of wine. She could smell wine. She could smell alcohol. And she had divorced the man, she had separated from the man, and I don't know what happened to the man, but she was living her life to what she considered normal. But that specific brand of wine was going crazy in this restaurant, and it just broke her, and it began to unchain all these reactions in her. Specifically, she wasn't aware that she had PTSD until this specific until this specific stimulus came into her life, and then dysfunction began. It's tough. PTSD is one of the toughest psychological disorders out there. But when you talk about the trauma and stress-related disorders, there's one that actually tends to be explored more, and that would move into the area of dissociation. So in dissociation, what is the opposite of association? So association is you join someone, right? You bond with someone. Dissociation is that you detach, you move away from someone. So this someone is yourself. Dissociation implies that you're removing yourself from the situation. In dissociation, there's 3 different types of disorders. All 3 are very unusual. First of all is dissociative amnesia. So dissociative amnesia implies that a person experiences a momentary moment of amnesia, like you lose total idea of your memory, total recollection of memory, and it may be linked to a specific traumatic event that you may have gone through. There may be, moments of dissociative amnesia when a person was perhaps robbed. And when the person was robbed, the person was also beat up. The person may have a momentary moment of dissociative amnesia, and it may not have been caused by the actual punches, but because the mind seemed to try to detach from that moment, so the person wouldn't have a recollection for it. Can that be a thing? Can that happen? It's very rare, but yes, it can happen. The strangest of all is the personalization, the realization disorder. And this one is that the person just feels like an external force, like watching the body, and it's almost like a spiritual wave. You're just seeing it from the outside and you're here. That is even brought up to criticism in the field because people say that it's too subjective and it's so unscientific that there should not be a way, or there should not be a reason for it to exist in the DSM. Go figure. I never saw a case of dissociative amnesia. I never saw a case of the personal realization disorder. But the most famous is dissociative identity disorder, which used to be called multiple personality disorder. Dissociative identity disorder refers to a person that leaves temporarily the sense of identity, the sense of self, and maybe not only leaves it temporarily, but the person may emerge to have a different identity coming from it. I never saw one case of DID in my professional experience, but I read about one case. Because in my work, I would do the clinical assessments, and sometimes hospitals would send paperwork to the hospital where I work. Medical hospitals would send paperwork to the psychiatric hospital where I worked, and I would review the clinical case. And I once read the case of a man that apparently had two identities, and one of the identities was claiming for suicide or suicidal ideation, thus a suicide, and this is where the person was being brought to treatment. I didn't saw the man, so personally I never saw a case of DID yet, but it exists. If you work on an outpatient basis, perhaps you may never encounter in your professional career a case of DID. DID may be more common in the inpatient world, and for specific diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder, there must be about 10 years of treatment. So it's not like you go to a clinical assessment and after an interview of an hour you come out with a diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder. It doesn't work that way. There must be a history of therapy, a history of treatment before you be given that diagnosis. Hollywood loves to make movies about DID. And the portrayal, the way that it's depicted on movies, make it seem like it's always negative. But you're smarter than that. Realize that what you see in fiction is one thing, it doesn't relate to real life. In your professional career, you may never encounter a case of DID, but if you do, realize that this is a very tough, very, very tough and delicate situation. And I mean this sincerely, most of the people that I met when I was working in the field were fantastic, really, really good people who just needed help. The talk about DID tends to be very subjective in classes of abnormal psychology because it's such an odd, unusual case that people say, what's the point of learning maybe that much about it if you're not going to see it? For sure, you're going to see much more cases of bipolar disorder, depression, schizophrenia, phobias, social panic attacks, you name it. But if you ever encounter a case of DID, remember it's a person that deserves respect. It's a person that requires your attention and your education. Read a lot. Get familiarized with it a lot. That ultimately will lead you to the best way to provide therapy for such a unique disorder. Good work, guys. See you in the next unit.